Unwoo had heard of a tiger that prowled within the palace walls, but she'd never expected to encounter it in her lifetime. Fear froze her in place as a tiger as large as her emerged from the shadows. Its teeth gleamed in the moonlight as it bared its sharp canines at her. And she wondered, was this a sign from the heavens? Was this to be how she died? To know how Unwoo ended up in this situation, we'll go back to earlier in the day when she'd sat down with the royal princess for tea time. Lee Unwoo, also known as Princess Wahan, listened to Princess Sukai as she explained that a royal decree had been issued, stating harmony would hold with the Jurchen people. Princess Sukai was a princess born of the current queen and younger sister to Grand Prince Gwangyang. Lee Unwoo noted how the princess had heard the news first, and she boasted about her capable subordinates. She smiled demurely at the princess, reading the hidden meaning behind the arrogant princess's words. She'd had spies watching Lee Unwoo. Sukai told her that the Jurchens had established a nation called Jin, and the emperor considered a royal marriage between nations. She laughed softly as she noted the uncertainty of the strength even though the country was established by barbarians. Her smile turned sharp as she gazed at Lee Unwoo and offered help for her long trek to the country. Lee Unwoo said nothing, but frustration ran rampant through her as she noted that while their age gap was nothing but a year, it would have been more appropriate for the royal princess to get married first. She bowed her head in submission as she thanked Sunhai for her generosity. Lee Unwoo felt utterly miserable since she was a powerless princess and could only accept the situation. Sukai walked out, and as the door closed, she huffed in annoyance at Lee Unwoo's proud attitude despite being helpless. She smirked at the thought of Lee Unwoo walking the same path as her mother once did, and when she fell to her knees at the end, Sukai would be sure to have a front-row seat. Lee Unwoo sat in her little room as she read the royal decree that had arrived, stating the words Sukai had shared. And Lee Unwoo understood this for what it was, a sacrificial offering disguised as a royal wedding. Sukai was the only royal princess of Joseon who had been raised with great care alongside the current queen's son, Grand Prince Gwangyang. They held all power within the palace. She lowered her head, the humiliation overwhelming, for she knew she'd been chosen because she'd been the easiest to deal with. Jiamyang, Unwoo's personal maid, sat off to the side, tears streaming down her face as she cried for her lady's predicament. Another attendant stood beside Jiamyang, and she scolded the girl for lack of control over her emotions. Unwoo stood as she announced that she'd be going on a short walk alone, and no one was to follow her. The court lady protested since it was quite late. However, Unwoo told her she'd be back soon. The forlorn look in Unwoo's eyes quieted her attendants as they knew that their lady needed some time to herself. She walked along the quiet pathway, the rustling leaves the only sound that reached her ears. The night air evoked in her a memory long forgotten, a time she'd stopped wishing for long ago. And in this memory, the sound of her mother's sweet laughter caused her still heart to beat in agony once more. She thought of Court Lady Mun and Jiamyang, who would have to spend the rest of their lives in a distant land filled with barbarians, as it was their duty to follow their lady, and the guilt weighed heavy on her. And the thought crossed her mind once more, unbidden. If she wasn't there, would their lives be any better? But the rustle of bushes drew her from her thoughts, her senses alerting her to danger nearby. It prowled forward unhurried. A tiger, almost as big as her, with its blood-stained coat and glowing yellow eyes, stared at her unblinking. Was this it? Was this how she lost her life? She grasped her ribbon-bound hair tightly, her body shaking in fear, but abruptly let go a moment later, her fear receding. She thought that perhaps this was heaven's way of telling her it was time. She crouched low as she noted the tiger's injured paw, and with clear eyes said, "If you're okay with it, I'll treat you." And a moment later, she tore at her underskirt. Vaguely, she wondered if she'd transcended all her fears and regrets, or if this was her wretched struggle to entrust her end to a tiger sent from the heavens. And once she'd bandaged its paw with her ribbon and cloth, she smiled in acceptance as she stated, "It's your turn now. Eat me." The tiger looked at the ridiculous woman before him and wondered how he'd come to be in this situation. He looked at her in disgust, for he'd never had the habit of enjoying human flesh. Unwoo, unaware of the tiger's thoughts, got down onto her hands, hoping to make the entire ordeal painless, and while her actions further irritated the tiger, his eyes narrowed in intrigue. Her fearlessness fascinated him, and he knew that she was different from the other humans he'd encountered, few as they were. But what caught his attention the most was the scent that drifted from her. He licked his teeth, tempted to do as she wished and take a bite out of her. The urge overwhelmed him, and he opened his wide mouth, ready to do just that. But a distant voice stopped him. The voice called out for Unwoo, and the tiger stepped back, its chance to eat her interrupted. But he would be back, he knew, for his delicious meal. Unable to resist, he licked at her with his large tongue, and the action surprised Unwoo. The tiger took off in the darkness, and Unwoo sat baffled at their interaction. Jiamyong rushed to her, and as she helped Unwoo to her feet, Unwoo questioned if she'd seen a huge tiger roaming around. Her question startled Jiamyong, and she looked around in fright, but Unwoo quickly calmed her down. She could still vividly recall the feel of its tongue on her cheek, and as she gave the small bridge one final glance, she wondered if, in that moment their eyes met, she'd been bewitched by the ember within its depths. And in the depths of Inwang Mountain resided the palace of the Tiger Clan. The brown-haired man noticed his lord's bloody hand as he sauntered by, and he questioned the injury, his worry evident. Baekwi, the Tiger Clan's king, gazed at Gongpil, his right hand, with steady golden eyes as he took his seat on the dais. Gongpil took hold of the ribbon, recalling that these materials belonged to humans, and Baekwi clutched at his head as he recalled his meeting with the human woman. Gongpil gasped, sure his lord had dabbled in the taboo arts of eating human flesh, but Baekwi groaned in annoyance. He told Gongpil that the human woman had acted on her own, as she'd practically begged him to eat her. However, he'd not gone through with it. Gongpil pointed out that her scent had lingered on Baekwi, and while initially he'd been shocked at Gongpil's words, he grinned at the thought that she'd marked him as well. Gongpil wondered if Baekwi felt a deep hunger for the woman, and Baekwi looked up, surprised his right hand had hit the nail on the head. Gongpil explained that the cause was instinct. Baekwi was drawn to the woman for one reason alone, because they were mated. Baekwi reared back in shock, but quickly dismissed the notion as nothing but nonsense. And back at Unwoo's place, she sat with the crown prince, Li Xian, born from the late queen. He looked at Unwoo with sympathetic eyes, as he'd heard the news of her marriage. He spoke of Lady Haibin, Unwoo's mother, and he felt the utmost gratitude that Unwoo had cared for the late queen in her mother's stead. Unwoo explained that once she left, it would be difficult to deliver any information as she'd done before, but the crown prince stated that while he understood, Unwoo should focus on taking care of herself. She smiled, and with a gracious bow, wished to hear news from afar of his ascent to the throne. That was how their meeting ended, and as Unwoo went on a leisurely walk, she thought about the crown prince and the much-needed support he'd given her in this vast, lonely palace. She knew that once she left, his fight would be all the harder now that he'd have to do it alone. She looked up at the approaching figure as it turned out to be Prince Gwangyang, son of the current queen. She bowed in formal greeting to the prince, but he spared no time for pleasantries as he questioned if she came from her meeting with the crown prince. He stared at her with a keen gaze, and Unwoo explained that she'd only stopped by to pay her respects. Prince Gwangyang stated that he'd been on his way to visit the crown prince when good fortune had them crossing paths. Unwoo only smiled in answer, but her attention went to the prince's guard. She felt uneasy as she gazed at the man, but the prince stole her attention once again as he spoke about her upcoming wedding to be held in spring. He offered any support, and Unwoo gave her thanks, but stated it was unnecessary since the palace would prepare everything. And with that, Prince Gwangyang waved her off. Having been dismissed, Unwoo quickly bowed once more and took her leave. But as she walked away, Unwoo couldn't shake the unsettling feeling of the man behind Prince Gwangyang. They watched Unwoo's retreating figure, and Prince Gwangyang asked, "Do you think she'd be of any use?" The man behind let loose a Cheshire cat smile as he noted that Unwoo would be very useful. The man had sensed the presence of a tiger from Unwoo, and the prince turned, surprised by the man's words. His green eyes glowed in deep interest at what he discovered. Back at Inwang Mountain, Baekwi took aim and let loose his arrow. And just as it hit the center of the target, Gongpil urged gently that Baekwi should meet the mysterious woman once more to confirm his mate theory. Gongpil guessed that the elders of the council had been more insistent lately for Baekwi to meet and marry a woman for the sake of their nation. Baekwi grimaced at the recollection. Gongpil tried once more to convince Baekwi to meet the woman, but stopped in fright as he found himself on the wrong side of Baekwi's bow and arrow. Baekwi smiled deviously as he threatened Gongpil not to say a word more about the matter or else. Gongpil broke out into a loud sob as he shouted out the words, "Even if you shoot, I will speak my mind." At his dramatic wail, Baekwi lowered his weapon and walked away, annoyed at Gongpil's rant. His right hand smiled, knowing his lord had conceded and offered to arrange the meeting, but Baekwi refused since he wanted to go alone. Gongpil ran after him, determined to tag along, but soon another subordinate kneeled at Baekwi's feet. Chanhwa, an elite soldier of the noble clan, explained that she'd taken care of the remnants of the marksmen, as ordered. However, she'd failed at sifting out the leader. Baekwi was sure that the man would eventually reveal himself and gave praise for a job well done. As he walked away, Gongpil called out to him, and he turned, fury etched in his features as he scolded his subordinate. And with that, he continued on his way as Chanhwa wondered the reason for their lord's annoyance, and Gongpil explained that Baekwi had finally met his companion, who turned out to be human. Chanhwa paused at the mention of that and abruptly turned to leave. Gongpil knew that Chanhwa's hatred for humans hadn't eased, and the reason involved her younger sibling. Eunwoo sighed as the weight of her life bore down on her. She'd lived like she was dead, words that were a silent imperial command. And she'd lived such a life righteously. But in the end, it was futile. Jiamyong worried that her lady would collapse as she struggled with her worries. Not long ago, her lady started hallucinating, and Jiamyong was sure the stress of everything had caused her much distress. She also worried the cold night air would make her lady sick, but Eunwoo wanted to stay out a little longer and ordered Jiamyong to return. After much fuss, Jiamyong left, and now Eunwoo stood all alone. She gazed up at the bare tree in the midst of winter, but all too soon this season would pass, and with that more change would come Eunwoo's way. She turned quickly as she felt the presence behind her, and her eyes widened as they landed on the silent gentleman. He smiled a small smile as he watched her silently, and after a mesmerizing moment, Eunwoo jumped back in alarm. She shouted for the guards, but suddenly she became acutely aware of how alone she was, not a palace attendant in sight. Baekwi watched the human woman with great amusement, for she wasn't afraid when facing a tiger, but was terrified of a human man. He observed her with a tilt of his head, the woman in front of him captivating him more with every encounter. He stepped closer, wanting to be closer as he reminded her of their first meeting. But Eunwoo flushed with anger, for she was certain she'd never met this stranger, as her palace was off-limits to many. He drew closer as he said, "Look carefully. Do you remember me now?" And after a moment's protest, recognition sparked as she gazed at the same fathomless golden eyes. It was the same eyes that had captivated her on a night much like this, but then it was not a man that stood before her. It was a tiger. He reintroduced himself by name, Baekwi, King of Tigers. Eunwoo displayed her obvious doubt, and Baekwi found this amusing. He repeated her words back to her as she'd offered herself to him as a meal. Realization slowly dawned on her as he recounted their first conversation, and the more he spoke, the more convinced Eunwoo was that this man was that very tiger. With their eyes locked, he closed in, his lips a breath away from hers. She startled at his sudden nearness, but he moved down to her neck and inhaled deeply. Eunwoo grew outraged at the man's actions while he regarded her thoughtfully as he said, "As expected, it's much more potent here." He reminded her that he'd licked her cheek, and Eunwoo flushed at the reminder. He explained that he'd marked her by doing that so he could find her again, and usually, the scent he'd left on her should have faded eventually. However, her scent had gotten stronger instead, a phenomenon he'd never heard of. Eunwoo listened with half a mind, still skeptical about Baekwi's claims, But she humored him as she stated that even if it were true, this information didn't affect her in any way. Her life would remain unchanged. But Baekwi dispelled her words easily as he explained the strange way his scent lingered on her could only mean one thing. They were fated. And because she was his, trouble would soon follow. But Baekwi wouldn't let that happen, he decided. Because he was the cause of this, he declared he'd take responsibility for her. His words caused Eunwoo's heart to stir strangely, and she bit back tears as she realized she'd had no control over her life. One mishap after another seemed to happen, and she wondered if this was heaven's punishment. Scowl fixed in place, she questioned how he planned to take responsibility as she mocked, "Will you marry me or something?" He smiled a secret smile as he said softly, "If you desire it, it shall be so." Eunwoo turned crimson at what she was sure were false words. She turned away as she told him to leave if he kept spouting nonsense, but Baekwi warned that she would regret it if he left. But Eunwoo was stubborn and wouldn't swallow back her words as she said, "Then it would be my regret to bear." But Baekwi wasn't offended by her tone, and consented to her wish for him to leave. He smiled softly as he pulled out her ribbon and told her that until the day came when she asked for a favor, he would keep her ribbon. She looked back, ready to fire off more scalding words, but Baekwi was gone as if the night's wind carried him away. Eunwoo frowned, upset by his departure even though she'd asked for it, and she wondered if this was nothing but a dream. Back at the Crown Prince's palace, his subordinate, Hong Jae-yong, entered his chambers, and it was there he relayed the information he'd gathered. He told the Crown Prince that someone backed Grand Prince Gwangnyeong. However, their origin and background remained unclear. They'd gained sudden notoriety within the capital, with many rumors spread far and wide about them, though which rumor rang true, one couldn't tell. Lee Seon sighed as he clutched at his head, his headache of foreshadowing of the problem this would be in the near future, lest they make haste. He ordered Hong Jae-yong to uncover the truth as soon as possible, and the man bowed in consent to his master's wishes. And once alone, Lee Seon felt the absence of Princess Hwa-han all the more, for she was a valuable source of information, and he felt anxiety gnaw at him. He looked up, determined to survive, for although his position as Crown Prince was hollow and without support, he wouldn't falter. For his very life depended on it. Deep in the mountains, Baekwi made his way back to Inwang Mountain. But shadowy figures fluttered about, hidden within the dark foliage. The masked man darted to a tree, and it was there where he planned to watch the Tiger King secretly. But as he settled in, Baekwi crushed the man's throat with his monstrous strength as he declared, "Who dares to follow me?" But Baekwi got his answer as he spotted the mask. It was a mask he recognized. Baekwi returned to his palace and was greeted enthusiastically by both Gongpil and a reserved Chanhwa. He smiled at Gongpil, whose eyes practically sparkled with curiosity, and Gongpil didn't deny his words. Baekwi took a firm, arrogant stance and smirked as he stated, "She proposed marriage." His words shocked his subordinates, and Gongpil conjured up the assertive female in his mind. But what he truly wanted to know was if his lord would truly marry the lady. Baekwi appeared thoughtful, and as her delicate yet alluring image came to mind, the idea of marriage sounded more and more appealing. But Chanhwa drew his attention to the mask he'd brought with him, and she questioned if it was a mask worn by one of the marked tribes. All thoughts of his soon-to-be bride vanished as he explained that he'd been followed on the way back, and Gongpil was sure that humans must have recognized his scent when he'd visited the palace. Baekwi addressed Chanhwa as he gave her new mission. Back at the palace, Princess Sukhai smiled at the array of assortments before her, used to nothing but the best, and the court lady smiled at the praise she received. But soon Sukhai's attention went to the object in the court lady's hand, and soon she had hold of the beautifully adorned trinket. The court lady explained that she'd bought it at the local marketplace. However, it was cheaply made, nothing worthy of the princess's attention. But soon Sukhai smiled deviously, for she knew how to put the object to good use. Eunwoo sat with her attendants as she read the book in front of her, or that's what she was supposed to be doing, but her mind had wandered, and her attendants took notice. They called out to her, worry evident on their faces, and she startled out of her reverie. She smiled in assurance, but the attendants knew better. But soon the arrival of Princess Sukai shocked them all, and they had little time to compose themselves. Unwoo was certain the princess was up to no good with this sudden visit. Soon she sat in front of Unwoo, and as she inquired about preparations for the wedding, she spread out an array of items. Unwoo appeared as baffled as she felt, and the princess explained that she'd needed proper jewelry when she left for another land. Sukai smiled haughtily as she stated that her generosity only extended to one item on the little table and no more. Unwoo sighed internally, ready to be done with this meeting, and picked the first thing that caught her eye, a beautiful flowery hair ornament, but she paused as Sukai stopped her. She told Unwoo that was a gift from the emperor for her birthday, so Unwoo couldn't have that. Unwoo realized Sukai's intentions to humiliate her, but she played along regardless. They continued this little game as Sukai explained all the importance of all the items that belonged to her until there was but one object left, the little trinket she'd taken earlier from her court lady. She took the trinket and thanked the princess, and Sukai smiled gleefully as she stated, "It suits you well." Sukai left Unwoo's palace feeling victorious in her little game, and Unwoo's attendants fumed at the petty treatment. But Unwoo was more captivated by the trinket, as it resembled the color of Baekwi's eyes. She recalled their last meeting, and she took a whiff of her skin, but all she caught were scents of the trees and forest. And so, she couldn't help but wonder, what if he was nothing but a fraud? But what befuddled her more was that more often than not, the man entered her thoughts. A loud noise outside alarmed Unwoo, and she stood, prepared to fight. Their footsteps sounded loud in her ears as they approached, and Unwoo reached for the little dagger she'd hidden away. A masked man appeared as he quietly entered, and Unwoo backed away in fright, for she was sure someone had sent an assassin after her. But who it was, she was uncertain. She unsheathed the dagger, and as she shouted for the man to stay away, she raised the weapon to her neck. The masked man paused in his approach as Unwoo threatened to end her own life if he took a step more, and with her actions, she'd confirmed that this was not an attempt to end her life, but rather a kidnapping.